This is lecture number DR008US02. This is the 8th of the Mega Genius lectures and the second lecture of the Uncommon Sense series. It was recorded on November 16th, 2000. The title of this lecture is Einstein Was Wrong. It is 41 minutes long. Copyright 2000 by Mega Genius. All rights reserved. This lecture is protected by internationally valid copyright. It may not, in whole or in part, be duplicated, transmitted, or otherwise reproduced without the express permission of Mega Genius. Unauthorized translation, importation, or distribution is a violation of applicable laws. Mega Genius is a United States federally registered trademark and service mark. And now, here is Mega Genius.
This would be a conclusion of average intelligence. As a result of many scientific breakthroughs, we live in a modern and highly technical culture with an appreciative and progressive understanding of ourselves and the universe. The most obvious problem of mankind is that it has a universe without an owner's manual. The 19th century American writer Gertrude Stein had man's astounding lack of knowledge in mind on her deathbed when a friend, searching for some enlightenment, asked, "What is the answer?" After a brief pause, Ms. Stein replied, "What is the question?" In fact, mankind has both an incalculable number of questions and an innumerable number of wrong answers. Most obvious question should be, which questions are most important and which answers to those questions are true? Let's look for a moment at the circumstances of our species. Man has no definitive evidence regarding the time, place, or form of his origin. If there is no one who knows how, or considers it worthwhile, to educate him clearly and convincingly about his beginnings, man himself might at least have kept understandable records of his past for the enlightenment of his descendants. Unfortunately, however, translations from Sanskrit, the most ancient writings of man, barely predating 10,000 years ago, reflect that our ancestors had no appreciable hindsight either. Consequently, man has proposed a multitude of theories. Estimates of the time of his earliest existence range from 5,000 to several million years ago and beyond. His place of origin, equally as vague, is alleged to be anywhere from the Middle East or Africa to some unidentified star system. Even the form of man's earliest development is believed by some to have been similar to the image of modern man, and by others to have resembled a naked rhizopod protozoan. Based on the diversity of the answers, an objective observer would wonder if we were all even looking at the same questions. The how and why of man's creation have been explained as the sudden and intentional act of a supreme being who perceived that it was a good thing to do. Many people, however, are convinced it was the accidental result of a minor electrochemical disturbance within the rush of some primordial sea. Similarly perplexing is the issue of where man is located, the answer to which appears to change by the moment, based on the latest geological and astronomical observations and conclusions. Apparently he is glued by an invisible force to the surface of a heavily drenched and slightly pear-shaped sphere that weighs nearly 7 sextillion tons and is spinning through the depths of space like a child's top. No more than an infinitesimal speck of debris in the universe, this spheroid is whirling at more than 1,000 miles per minute around and around a 27 million degree Fahrenheit ever-burning fireball of radiation more than 1 million times the size of Earth. At a distance from you of 93 million miles, this perpetual spark from the furnace of the universe is itself a mere particle of cosmic dust, hurling at more than 180 miles per second within the Milky Way galaxy, itself composed of more than 100 billion other ever-burning fireballs, careening through infinite space at another 170 miles per second. Here is a way to experience some semblance of union with the creation of this universe, and size up the roles played within it by the powers that be on this inconspicuous planet. Some dark and silent evening, after you have scanned that day's momentous world news, venture into the solitude of the midnight air, step back from the lights of civilization, and let your gaze drift upward, soaring through the infinite vastness of interstellar space. Soon your eyes will randomly focus on a single star, perhaps Rigel, for example, in the constellation Orion. Its light has been speeding toward you at more than 186,000 miles per second for 500 years, traversing some 3 quadrillion miles during that time. Nevertheless, what you are looking at may not even exist. It could have exploded into oblivion even before Copernicus advanced his radical theory that the Earth revolves around our Sun rather than vice versa, and you would not be aware of it yet, since the light from the explosion still would not have reached your eyes. Just to watch the light streak from one side of our galaxy to the other would require your continuous attention for more than 100,000 years. Furthermore, lest you think you are beginning to grasp the magnitude of this expanding panorama, take another step back and juggle this thought. Although you cannot see more than 6,000 stars in our Milky Way galaxy with your unaided eyes, each of them represents more than 16 million additional stars in this single galaxy that you cannot see because of the distance. We can begin counting them tonight at the rate of 1 star each second, and never sleep again. Just count, and we will still be counting in the year 5000 and beyond. And that's just our minor galaxy. Doesn't that cast an interesting perspective on your day-to-day problems in a workaday world? Stepping back again and expanding our vision still further, astronomers estimate there are at least 200 billion more galaxies racing through our universe, the boundaries of which, if they exist at all, remain to be glimpsed by our most sophisticated astronomical technology. All of this has been going on for billions and billions of years by extremely conservative estimates. What additional wonders may frolic outside the physical universe in other universes and sub-universes is anyone's guess. Do you think we are the only intelligent life form that exists throughout the entirety of that magnanimous structure? Or do you think we are not alone? Either thought is quite astonishing, don't you think? Now let's take one more step back from this astounding vista. Mankind finds himself riveted by an invisible and unexplained force to the surface of a minute and wobbling ball mysteriously suspended deep in space and surrounded by at least 10 sextillion, that's 10 followed by 21 zeros, enormous and perpetually exploding fireballs that, in some apparently orderly fashion, have been whizzing all about in boundless space for many billions of years, if not much longer. His most advanced scientific instruments indicate that he is journeying through uncharted space in at least 8 directions simultaneously. He isn't sure where, when, how, why, or in what form he occurred. He has only the vaguest idea of where he is in relation to where he is not, and he has not a clue as to where he is supposed to be going, how to get there, or what to do when he arrives. This is all rather as if a total amnesiac were tightly strapped to the side of a wildly revolving rocket-powered roller coaster careening endlessly through a pitch-black infinitude. Hey, Mom, look at me. Well, now let's focus back in until we can discern the faint light from the second-rate Milky Way galaxy, and then a third-rate star in the remote area of its rim, and then an infinitesimal particle of refuse that we call Earth. All right, what do you think the chances are that mankind will think himself safely through the stupefying, exploding enigma? Actually, his chances are non-existent unless he learns to reason much more intelligently. Reasoning is not an entirely lost art, but more than 99% of the human race use the identical formula to make up their minds about anything of importance. They believe what is most convenient and disregard everything else. The brazen fact is that almost all of your friends, relatives, and neighbors essentially believe what they were programmed to believe from the day they were born. Chances are you do too. Just look at what we do to our children. Under the pretext of teaching them to think for themselves, we literally inundate them through television, radio, computers, books, magazines, schooling, motion pictures, lectures, newspapers, and advertisements, with a veritable avalanche of ill-conceived opinions that masquerade as unadorned facts. One would think we are terrified of the conclusions that children might reach if we neglected to manipulate their thoughts from every corner of their environment, and God help the youngster who, for whatever reason, even thinks about substantially questioning conventional belief. At best, we begrudge and often ostracize him. At worst, we identify him as an enemy. Opinions depend primarily upon two factors for their power to compel agreement. First is the quality of the source, meaning that if an authoritative figure alleges that something is true, it must be true. Here is the mother who dabs the cut on the finger of her screaming and cavorting 5-year-old with tincture of iodine, insisting all the while that if it didn't sting like hell, it wouldn't work. Here is the religious instructor who urges the youngster to lock his palms together beneath a bowed head in the proper attitude of prayer and mimic phrases containing words that the child really doesn't understand. Here is the kindergarten teacher who attempts to handle the child's emotional reaction to a broken toy by maintaining that big boys don't cry. So, 70 years later, the child still avoids antiseptics that don't hurt, clasps his hands in prayer without the slightest idea why, and stoically resists the impulse to release emotion that's too painful to deny. If the authorities of his youth had not died decades before, they would be proud. The other factor that ensures agreement is the quantity of the source. If enough people associated with a person agree about something, anything, chances are that he will soon believe it too. In essence, that's why tennis players wear whites, businessmen knot their necks with ties, earrings are in, nose rings are out, and most native Hawaiian foods are considered unpalatable by mainlanders. The influence of common agreement strikes deeply, too, for the opinions of family members, friends, and groups with which a child relates mold even his concepts of what is right, wrong, good, and bad. Interestingly, neither of these two factors contribute appreciably to man's understanding of anything. The flaw in authoritative agreement is that the foremost authority of one's beliefs should always be oneself. After all, they are his beliefs. Instead, far too often we find it more convenient to automatically agree with someone else's opinion than to think for ourselves. The trouble with common agreement is that the human race has had eons to align the thought processes of its members, yet throughout countries, races, and religions, disagreement among mankind about even the fundamentals of his existence still runs amok. The path of least resistance would be for both children and adults to settle upon a middle road between the dogma of authorities and the pressure of their peers, and that's exactly what they do. Year after year they plod along the trail of least disagreement, clutching to their breasts the often irrational opinions of others, seldom if ever pausing to consider how they came to believe what they are convinced is true. Bertrand Russell, the 20th century English philosopher, thought about that and managed to reach his own conclusion. Quote, "Most people would sooner die than think. In fact, they do so." Unquote. Let's imagine the case of a fellow we will call Thomas, born somewhere in the American Midwest in the mid-19th century. Now, based just upon that scant information, approximately when and where he lived, we could compile a foot-thick file about his probable beliefs. For example, chances are that he was raised as a Protestant, influenced against the Confederacy, and taught that a woman's place was in the home. The odds are extremely high that he felt his country was justified in having broken every treaty with the American Indians and in having warred with the English and the Mexicans. In fact, almost all his beliefs probably paralleled those of his associates and the authorities of the day. Thomas's mind, along with those of almost 100% of the human race, was a product of time and place. What if he had been born, however, in Alabama, or on an Indian reservation in the Southwest, or a few miles inside the Mexican border? How different would his basic religious beliefs have been if he had been raised in Iran, or India, or Tibet? What if he had been an Australian Aborigine, an Eskimo, a Zulu? Well, now let's manipulate the time factor. What if Thomas had still been born in the sector known today as the American Midwest, but in 1700, in 1255, in 380 BC? Furthermore, how different would his convictions have been in any of those eras compared to the ones he would form if he were born in the future, in 2950. What in the world might he believe then? Furthermore, we could juggle both variables simultaneously, locating him in Rome in 71 BC during the height of the Spartacus slave revolt, or in Spain in 1482 in the midst of the barbaric Spanish Inquisition, or in some Southeast Asian village in 1971 amid the horrors of the Vietnam War. In each instance, we would have significantly altered many, if not almost all, of Thomas's basic beliefs, just by adjusting the latitude and longitude of his existence, or the date, or both. Now, every age and location harbors its own beliefs. One of the most influential is always that we live in modern times, whether the populace is proclaiming that the sun revolves around a flat earth, extolling the virtues of slavery, or burning witches in Salem, Massachusetts. You see, no one has ever lived in the mistaken cultures of the past. One can only live in today, which is always modern times, and that makes whatever is believed now seem unquestionably right. So, it would appear that Thomas's most cherished beliefs and subsequent actions depend primarily on his location in space and time. To believe so, however, would be a grave mistake, for we could only arrive at that conclusion by believing what is most convenient. Rather, Thomas's beliefs and actions mirror his ability or inability to rigorously question the allegations of his contemporaries. All that one experiences depends on one's ability to think for oneself. Now, all that sounds correct, but as we enter the 21st century, haven't we finally risen above our ancestors' susceptibility to primitive reasoning? Doesn't the evidence indicate that the ignorance of the past has at last been swept aside by the age of modern science? Well, apparently that is precisely what most of us believe today, for few questions have not been substantively answered by the very best authorities, quite thoroughly agreed upon by large sectors of the public, and high pressure injected into the absorbent minds of our up-and-coming generations with righteous determination. Mankind evolved from apes. The brain is the source of thought. Man only lives once. The speed of light is a constant that can never be exceeded. Flying saucers are bunk. Matter and energy can neither be created nor destroyed. Are all 6 of those statements true, or are some of them false? I would only suggest that you think at length and extremely carefully before you answer. I've selected them for 2 reasons. First, each conclusion is commonly believed to be a fact. Second, regardless of what you may have been taught by authorities, or have found convenient or profitable to believe, the total evidence that exists at this time to support each conclusion is merely smoke and mirrors, all of which will evaporate within the 21st century. Yet these are not considered to be opinions, but facts, unquestionable truisms, proven to the greatest minds of our time beyond any reasonable doubt. What, however, is proof? Blow the chaff aside, and it is merely evidence sufficient to convince. That's all. To which I might add, sufficient to convince people at specific locations in certain times. Regardless of where you search for proof, you will only find it in the eye of the beholder. Understanding that, you should not be surprised to learn, for example, that prior to 1830, most Americans believed the tomato was a deadly poisonous fruit. The proof was that their neighbors believed so too. Neither should you have difficulty understanding that in 1922, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of the intriguingly deductive mind of Sherlock Holmes, the master sleuth, was an ardent believer in the existence of fairies. 4-winged, tutu-clad, magic-powered fairies. The proof was that he had seen them in a photograph that 2 young girls had claimed was authentic, later established to be a hoax. Perhaps you recall that in 1938, Orson Welles' Mercury Theater radio broadcasts of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, which dramatized an invasion from Mars, panicked thousands of citizens throughout the northeastern United States. Telephone lines and highways jammed, people armed themselves to defend their lives, and some simply surrendered to the inevitable by committing suicide. The proof was that they had heard it on the radio. Dare we recall the series of articles in the New York Sun in 1835 that reported the telescopic discovery of an array of flora and fauna on the moon, including 38 species of trees, replete with bears, cranes, pelicans, and herds of creatures resembling bison, unicorns, and orangutan-faced bird-like monstrosities bedecked in shining copper-colored hair, prancing about a 266-mile-long lake near pyramid-shaped mountains of amethyst. Even the New York Times believed the articles reflected, quote, the most extensive and accurate knowledge of astronomy, unquote. Preposterous, you say? Perhaps, but not to the minds of most Americans, who gullibly believed what they read. The American poet and short story writer Edgar Allan Poe, who frequently thought for himself, thought it was malarkey, but noted distressfully that nearly all the people with whom he talked believed that it was the sacred truth. The proof was that they had read it in the newspaper. Certainly there are many among us who remember when it was believed that a sustained speed of 35 miles per hour in an automobile was sure to cause suffocation. Not long ago, United States Surgeon General Sternberg scoffed at reported dangers of X-rays, insisting that there was abundant evidence, sufficient to convince, of the, quote, entirely safe results, unquote, of their use. Just a few years ago, the American medical authorities extensively criticized the consumption of vitamin E supplements as foolish. Now, a recent survey shows almost all of our physicians take them, and current research reflects great benefits when taken in megadoses. And will the day ever pass without the results of some new study indicating that something that was good for you yesterday is bad for you today, or vice versa? Scientists are often extremely wrong. For example, in May of 1992, scientists for the Department of Energy began to strongly promote Yucca Mountain, Nevada, as absolutely the safest site for the disposal of nuclear waste. Their proof was their determination that there had been no significant earthquake there in more than 10,000 years. Do I detect an assumption? The following month, Yucca Mountain was struck by an earthquake measuring 5.6 on the Richter scale. There are innumerable other examples. Complacent acceptance of the dictates of modern science and religions and hypnotic agreement with the presumptions of thousands or even billions of human beings who can't all be wrong is not the road to man's evolutionary enlightenment. Rather, it only leads to further mental enslavement and an utterly false sense of knowledge. Actually, it is the very route to the unanticipated brink of man's self-annihilation. In truth, the cobblestones of man's progress from his murky origin, when he has progressed at all, have been the original conclusions of a few intelligent individuals who looked with their own eyes and thought with their own minds first. I guarantee that the most meaningful advances of the 21st century and beyond will not issue from the acts of scientists scrutinizing cerebral neurons, contemplating E=mc², or excavating antiquated East African monkey bones. Scientists will never find a true missing link. It does not exist. The actual missing link in the evolution of man has been too obvious to have been discovered: the age of reasoning for himself. One of the few persons born in the American Midwest in the mid-19th century who did reason for himself revolutionized the world with his unconventional, often called ridiculous, conclusions. Sometimes his research carried him into such diverse areas as nutrition, medicine, telepathy, reincarnation, and disembodied intelligences, or little people, as he called them, who he believed traveled about in space looking for newly born human bodies to inhabit. Sometimes the evidence that he accumulated supported his theories to the satisfaction of the public and the press. More often, he stood alone. But no one who is familiar with this unorthodox visionary of the 20th century could have denied that he thought about almost everything with his own mind first and last. Who was this man, originally considered to be a blue-ribbon crackpot? Well, in time, the world at large came to know him as the Wizard of Menlo Park, the man of the century, and inventor of the incandescent lamp, the phonograph, and motion pictures. He held more patents than any human being before or since, including more than 1,000 for his discoveries relating to radio, telephonics, telegraphy, mimeography, electric power, ore separation, automobiles, batteries, cement, typewriters, chemicals, rubber, aviation, almost every area of man's existence that caught his momentary fancy. Yet, contrary to popular belief, Thomas Alva Edison was not primarily an inventor. Not from his viewpoint. That was merely the manner in which he supported his true interest. Quote, "My business is thinking," unquote, he insisted. Quote, "The man who doesn't make up his mind to cultivate the habit of thinking misses the greatest pleasures in life," unquote. How did the father of electric light correlate his own conclusions with the authorities of his day? Did he study their supposedly irrefutable facts? Did he ponder their great scientific wisdom? Quote, "At the time I experimented with the incandescent lamp, I did not understand Ohm's law," unquote, he revealed in his later years. Quote, "Moreover, I do not want to understand Ohm's law. It would prevent me from experimenting," unquote. Quote, "When I start in to experiment with anything, I do not read the books. I don't want to know what has been done," unquote, he explained. And he remarked, quote, "School? I've never been to school a day in my life. Do you think I would have amounted to anything if I had?" Unquote. Quote, "There is something wrong with the college system," unquote, he declared after examining some 2,000 college applicants for employment in his facilities and promptly eliminating 97% of them. Subsequently, he insisted, quote, "The present system does not train men to think," unquote. Did you ever wonder what became of the first workable incandescent lamp, the forerunner of today's modern light bulb? Is it in the Edison Laboratory still, or perhaps the Smithsonian Institution? No, it was smashed by Thomas Edison, who, thinking for himself, decided he could contribute more to your life by re-examining the bulb's filament than by saving it as a priceless object of Americana. Later, however, he produced several duplicates of his original light bulb, one of which he used in a special ceremony in October of 1929, known as the Golden Jubilee of Light, commemorating the 50th anniversary of his invention in 1879. Many years ago, I was able to obtain one of Thomas Edison's rare Golden Jubilee of Light incandescent lamps through his daughter, the late Madeline Edison Sloan. Today, I keep the unique and decorative lamp close beside me on my desk. I examine it frequently. It serves as a continual reminder of what its creator, the genius of futuristic technology, who perceived himself as long on ideas but short on time, thought about the accumulated knowledge of the human race and the arrogance of 20th century intellectuals and the potential for future generations to stagger man's imagination with unfathomable discoveries in every field of their endeavor. Near his life's end, Thomas Edison condensed his conclusion for you in just 10 words. Quote, "We don't know a millionth of 1% about anything," unquote. Nevertheless, in his later years, the acclaimed nuclear physicist and celebrated genius Albert Einstein believed that he had finally achieved a basic comprehension of the macrocosm and man's progress within it. He concluded, quote, "Two things are infinite, the universe and the stupidity of man," unquote. Einstein, however, was wrong. The universe is not infinite. Not quite. Prize-winning roses won't flourish in a bed of waist-high sawgrass, so take a moment to thoroughly weed and clear the garden of your mind. It wasn't you who planted most of that unfruitful overgrowth anyhow. Then spade it deeply from corner to corner. We are about to begin some heavy-duty sowing. Here are 2 megatruths which will never let you down and will carry you far indeed. You would do well to keep them in mind at all times. Again, they are pearls of wisdom. A narrow mind is the hallmark of ignorance. An open mind is the seed of understanding. Besides, there is nothing we can discover that is any more preposterous than the actual circumstance in which mankind finds himself, as he and his nearly infinitesimal planet is dragged through the bowels of this immense machine we call the physical universe and thrust into still another millennium of the unknown. At the beginning of this lecture I gave you a conclusion of average intelligence, which was this: as a result of many scientific breakthroughs, we live in a modern and highly technical culture with an appreciative and progressive understanding of ourselves and the universe. Well, now I'll give you a conclusion that reflects superior intelligence, which would be this: most of man's authoritative knowledge of his past, present condition, and future, and of the physical universe's origin, laws, and mechanics, is based on erroneous convictions. This crucial aberration is a direct result of his failure to understand deception, his propensity to believe what is convenient, and his limited progress in the field of intelligence. The whole world has been brainwashed, including you and all of your friends. Many things will change on this planet in the near future, and you need to understand the subject of brainwashing better than you do. One of the components of brainwashing is propaganda, an emotionally charged word that merely means, quote, the dissemination of information, opinions, facts, or ideas with the intent to influence, unquote. You see, the data may or may not be true. Public relations firms prefer to call it advertising. Propaganda pertains to communication. Brainwashing only means, quote, any action intended to convince or change someone's mind, unquote. The mind may be changed for the better or the worse. It is one of the objectives of advertising. Brainwashing pertains to thinking. Now, compare that to selling, which is, quote, any action intended to persuade or influence someone to do or accept something, unquote. It may or may not be to the person's benefit. Selling pertains to doing. You see, one disseminates information, opinions, facts, or ideas with the intent to influence another, thereby changing his mind and subsequently causing him to accept or do what one wants. Simply stated, first you use propaganda to brainwash, and then you close the sale. The difference between educating and brainwashing is your approval or disapproval of what is taught. Brainwashing might more accurately be termed mind-washing, or better still, mind-changing. To most of us, brainwashing conjures visions of the indoctrination and conversion of a family member or friend into an opposing political faction or religious cult. Yet we customarily and often fervently support programs to educate others about our beliefs and to persuade them to accept our ideas as their own. How often have you urged, coaxed, or even argued to persuade another to accept your point of view as the one that was right? Nevertheless, any time one person acts with the intent to change a fundamental belief of someone else, you will find plenty of support for either contention that education or brainwashing is occurring. It all depends on one's point of view, even though viewpoints often change. After all, what is any major religion but a small cult that became popular? There are 4 basic forms of brainwashing, each with a different degree of workability. The more you understand and use the genius formula, the less effect any of them will have on you. The first type uses soft sell techniques. It is the most workable because it is generally effected with the most agreement from the person to whom it is directed. In other words, the more the subject agrees with the brainwasher, the easier he is to convince and the less likely he is to regret his decision later. It's the I am here to help you, my friend approach. Now, you'll commonly find this first form throughout our culture, for example, in radio, television, motion pictures, and other video and sound recordings, magazines and newspapers, T-shirts, grocery displays, fashions, furnishings, automotive design, skywriting, charity drives, political speeches, religious addresses, and in the general parental instruction of children. It is the basis of all public relations, including black PR, which is defined as, quote, the practice of inducing the public to have misunderstanding for and false ill will toward a person, action, or organization, unquote. The distinguishing characteristic of this classification of brainwashing is that it does not involve any significant use of force. Now, the second form of brainwash uses hard sell techniques. It does involve the use of force and is represented by any kind of dissemination or instruction that one feels required to receive. This form is the "you will hear me out whether you want to or not" approach, and you will find it in most public and private educational systems: the parental instruction of children when soft sell doesn't work, peer pressure and other demands of conformity, the abused spouse syndrome, mental torture, and much religious proselytization, including those techniques that involve the restriction of the intended convert's communication with his family and friends. It is also covertly the basis of hypnotism. The deprogramming of a convert almost invariably falls within the second classification of brainwash itself, as it is simply the application of the same fundamental procedure that was used by the other side to change the subject's mind one more time. A widespread and long-term example was the propaganda within communist-controlled regions that was forced upon the captive populace. It is also the basis for the kind of television commercials that most people would find offensive and obnoxious. Madison Avenue would be wise to reconsider the cost-effectiveness of those artless advertising idiocies that do not have the agreement of the viewers. People will agree most readily with someone or something that they like, enjoy, and want to be near, and they are most attracted to something that arouses their curiosity, not their anger. This second form of brainwash is more detrimental to understanding, and therefore is less workable in the long run than the first type. The third basic form of brainwash uses hard sell with a capital H techniques, and has been kept secret from the public for reasons of national security. Although it has never been openly discussed by governments, the Central Intelligence Agency isolated the basic technology in a program codenamed MK Ultra in the early 1950s. It is the "I will force you to do whatever I want" approach. It is known in governmental intelligence circles as pain drug hypnosis, or PDH. This nefarious psychological technique, initially advanced during the Korean War, can be used to compel captives to act in contradiction to their own moral or ethical codes at future specified times. A victim is first rendered helpless and stupefied by the ingestion, usually by injection, of one or more mind-altering drugs, and then subjected to physical torture by any means that normally does not leave telltale evidence. Coincident with the pain and drug treatment, the subject is implanted with one or more post-hypnotic suggestions intended to cause him to advocate some particular policy, commit specific or non-specific crimes, or otherwise behave at some future date or location in the manner dictated by the implant. In addition, he is implanted with a post-hypnotic suggestion to cause him to completely forget that the PDH incident ever occurred. Standard hypnosis is a loose cannon that will broadly be considered a crime soon within the 21st century. Thorough examination reveals that it is highly unpredictable in its effects, many of which are unrecognized and detrimental to the subject. Hypnosis does not work on certain types of people. For example, those whose intelligence is too low or too high. The former is already deeply hypnotized, although neither the subject nor the hypnotist realizes it, and bona fide geniuses are too awake to be affected by hypnotic techniques. One whose intelligence approximates the normal range, however, will usually respond to standard hypnosis and can be induced to commit acts that he normally would never consider, but it is not significantly effective in forcing him to violate his own morals or ethics. PDH, however, when properly administered, has no such drawbacks with persons of below average to above average intelligence. It is not workable on the extremely intelligent. Of course, since the subject retains no recall of the treatment, he will invent justifications for his future unethical acts, while the actual perpetrators remain unnoticed and appear to evade responsibility for their crimes. precise and infallible techniques to quickly identify those who have been PDH'd and to thoroughly nullify the mental effects of these crimes against humanity could easily be formulated within minutes by anyone with a thorough understanding of the human mind. But the technology to identify victims and erase the effects has not yet been discovered by any government, and given their current understandings of the subject, is unlikely to be invented by any government. Meanwhile, terrified by the ramifications of PDH and with no effective defense, the policy of governments remains, the less said about PDH, the better. Now, the fourth form of brainwash is similar to PDH, but much more advanced. It is cleaner and easier to effect and control. Instead of relying primarily on physical pain and drugs, it is based on electronics, mental pain, and hypnosis, and uses force of an extremely high degree. The horrendous effects of normal PDH are greatly augmented by the introduction of certain electronic phenomena. Again, the extensive effects are easy to undo, but it requires the application of an extremely exact technology. The electronic frequencies needed to conduct this type of brainwash have not yet been discovered on this planet. So, we see that regardless of the euphemisms by which we choose to know it, brainwashing is all around us every day. If practiced with a light touch, it can be helpful. Enforced upon us, irritating. Delivered heavy-handedly and without compassion, criminal. But we should understand what it is, for it is here to stay. This art of persuasion through the gradient use of force, as opposed to the more ethical gradient use of understanding, is big business, big bucks, and historically an integral part of all social interaction. If you don't live your own life, someone will surely live it for you. Similarly, to the degree that you do not think intelligently, with the genius formula, others will continually bombard you with propaganda and brainwash you with increasingly harsh techniques designed to sell you their bill of goods. Too often, it will be solely for their benefit, not yours.